my name is Rachel, and I'm here to continue our series on biblical literacy. How many of us have heard people say, everything happens for a reason? Probably a very common phrase, but one that actually can be very dangerous. In theology, it's called Meticulous Providence, or a more basic way of looking at it, the sovereignty of God. The basic idea behind this theodicy is that God is sovereign, meaning, in this view, he's in control of every single detail in the universe. Put another way, everything that happens is the will of God. It can be argued that this view did not exist for at least the first 400 years of the church, if not much longer. Prior to that, when people talked about the will of God, what they meant was God's moral intention for the universe. But after a theologian by the name of Augustine in the 4th century, and then John Calvin in the Reformation, and then a number of people after that, when people talked about God's will, they meant God's control over the universe. That's a very different idea. So something happens and people say, oh, it must be God's will. Or something does not happen, and so people say, oh, it must be what? Not God's will? See, it's a very different kind of take on the will of God. A ton of people think like this. Think of a number of the cliches that you hear on a regular basis when bad things happen. For example, God is sovereign. People say that all the time. Oh, I know God is sovereign. Or its follow-up, God is in control. Do you know that? Or do you say that from time to time? What people mean is, I don't really get it, but I know God is in control of this, good or bad. God has a plan. You hear that all the time. One critic of this view says it's almost like people believe there's a divine blueprint behind every single event in the story of your life. No matter what it is, good, bad, neutral, in between, something happens, but you say, oh, God has a plan. I know there's a divine blueprint. And then, of course, there's everything happens for a reason. And everybody says that. Followers of Jesus, people that aren't followers of Jesus, it's just out there. And a lot of people honestly believe this. But it can be argued that this is at odds against the teachings of the Bible, the writings of the Old and the New Testament. On the front end, this way of thinking gives you comfort, like, oh, this is really bad, but God's sovereign, God's in control, everything happens for a reason. Okay, I just have to wait and see what it is. But then on the back end of this view, you get a crisis of faith. God is sovereign, but my child was born with cerebral palsy. God is sovereign over that? God's in control, but my daughter was just raped at university. God's in control of that. God has a plan, but I'm 35 and I'm still single and I'm aching for a husband and a family and I just don't see it. It doesn't make any sense to me. God has a plan. Do you see that? Front end comfort. Oh, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. Because we want to know that somebody's in control. If not us, then God. But then on the back end of that, God in your mind's eye, in your imagination, becomes a moral monster. And you see this in Job. At first, the Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. But then he starts to follow that line of thinking through to its logical conclusion, and by the end he's raging against God. You are not only amoral, you are immoral, is what he's saying to God. This can lead you to a toxic view of what God is like, because you think that God is responsible for all sorts of not only good, but also evil in your life. As a direct quote from John Piper, everyone who dies, dies because God wills they die. Compare and contrast that with what Paul writes in the Bible in 1 Corinthians 15:24. Then the end will come, when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father, after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. For he, Jesus, must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. And then look at this. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. So for Paul, the writer of a huge chunk of the New Testament, death and all of his friends are not God's will, but flat out God's enemy. In his imagery here, God is at war with evil, not in collusion with it. Well, what does this mean? It means that all sorts of things happen every single day that are not God's will at all. In fact, they are deeply at odds against God's will. Yes, God is all powerful and all good, but it could be argued that God does not always get his way. You have to factor in the reality that human beings and spiritual beings have free will to either partner with God for all that is good and beautiful and true, or to rebel and rage against God. The world is a terrifyingly free, beautiful, wild, dangerous place, and evil is the byproduct of that creative freedom. Dr. Jerry Brashears puts it this way: evil is the result of the morally significant, free actions of God's creatures. Meaning, evil is not the result of God at all. Evil is the result of the freedom that God built into the fabric of the universe. When you read from Genesis all the way through to the end, you don't see a God in control of every single detail in the universe at all. You see a God in control of some things, but you see a God who created the world out of love. But this world has been overrun by a hostile alien invader that goes by the name of evil. As John writes, the whole world is under the control, not of Jesus, he writes, of the evil one. He writes that after Jesus' death and resurrection. And then when I read the story of God, I see a God who is at war with evil. Through the suffering, love, and sacrifice of his son, Jesus and his family, his sons and daughters, you and me, this God is at work to overcome evil with good, and in time to usher in the kingdom of God once and for all. But in the meantime, planet Earth is the site of a war. It's the site of a battlefield, and there's collateral damage all over the place. This obviously is a very different take on evil. Now, usually, when people think about the debate and all the controversy about sovereignty versus free will, usually people think about it along a spectrum. So on one side, you have a high view of God's sovereignty, a high view of how in control of the universe God is. Now, everybody kind of agrees that God is sovereign, but nobody agrees to what extent. And on this side, you have meticulous providence, and then a little closer in, you have Calvinism, and all sorts of well-known writers and teachers over the years. Then on the other side, you have Arminianism, which says God doesn't cause evil, but God does allow it. And in this view, God is a little bit more out of bounds. And it's the rest of human freedom or spiritual freedom, and God is kind of there and doesn't cause it, but he does allow it. And then past that, you have open theism, which is a whole other thing. And if I had to pick, if I was kind of forced into the framework, I would definitely lean more towards the free will of things. But here's the thing. Both sides argue from the Bible. Both sides have a ring of truth. And I really think there is a better way to come at this conversation. Not as a spectrum with a right and a left, but more as a web or a nexus. This is based on Jesus' prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So just think about that for a moment, because we say it all the time. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth. Notice Jesus assumes something in this prayer. He assumes that right now God's will is not done on earth. Does that make sense? Otherwise, you'd not pray for God's will to be done on earth. Jesus assumes that heaven is the place where God's will is done all of the time. But earth is the place where God's will is not always done. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Why? Because on earth, there are other wills at play. We can break them down into 5 categories. First off is God's will. As I said, everybody agrees that God is sovereign. Nobody agrees what that means. What I think that means is that God is king and God can do whatever he wants. And it could be suggested that there are times, rare times, when God co-opts evil for his own purposes. Sometimes to discipline you or me, sometimes to mature you or me, to grow us up. You need to learn something. God needs to teach me a lesson, or other times to keep evil in check. An example might be the police shooting someone, holding up a school, keeping children hostage. The police shoot the perpetrator to ensure the children can walk out free. A great example in the Bible is that of the exile. After hundreds of years of warning Israel to repent for idolatry and injustice, God finally says, okay, enough is enough. He takes away his hand of protection, and literally within months, Babylon is there at the door. Syria up in the north, Babylon down in the south, and Babylon comes in to wipe Jerusalem off the map and take Israel into captivity. Was that God? Kind of. It was Babylon, and God did not override Babylon's will. But that was God, whether it's direct or indirect. That was God essentially saying, okay, here you go, to discipline you, to mature you, to put a stop to evil. There are times when God causes evil, if not directly, then indirectly. But I think they are the exception to the rule. Don't assume the evil in your life is from God. Don't assume that it's God's hand to discipline you or to mature you or to teach you a lesson. Learn all you can out of a time of suffering in your life, but don't just assume that it is God. And keep in mind that there's a huge difference between Israel going into exile for her idolatry and compare that to the birth of a stillborn child. They are two very different stories. So first you have to factor in God's will. God has a hand in our life. Secondly, we have to factor in our will. So Alexander Solzhenitsyn, on coming back to Russia after years in exile, he was criticised for eating and drinking with the corrupt politicians that were still in power. And it was really interesting. When asked about it, he said this: "The line between good and evil runs straight through the middle of the human heart." What he was saying is that what we want to do as human beings, particularly here in the West, we want to locate evil externally, out there, in someone else, when the reality is it's located internally, right in here, right in you, right in me. In the therapy world, I'm the innocent victim, but my ex or my dad is the guilty perpetrator. Innocent victim, guilty perpetrator. That's how we want to come at it. But in reality, and we all know this, our own heart is anything but black or white. It's grey a lot of the time. There's darkness that is in there, even as followers of Jesus. We are responsible for so much evil, not only in the world at large, but evil in our own life. Some suffering, if not a lot of suffering, in our life is the byproduct of our own sin, of our own poor judgment, of bad decisions we make, of immaturity. We can't blame God for that. And we can't even blame Satan for that. We have to accept responsibility, not with guilt, not with shame, but with humility. So there's God's will, and then there's our will. And then thirdly, there's other people's will. So other people have freedom just like you and me, and a lot of people choose to use and abuse that freedom. There are evil people who do evil things, people who abuse children, people who sell women and children into trafficking, or on a lesser idea, people who lie about you at work or betray you or cheat on you or so on and so forth. But just like you and just like me, they're free. And they often wreak havoc in the world and cause at times catastrophic suffering in our life. So some suffering is caused not by us, but by other, not by God, by other people. Then fourth, you have to factor in what the New Testament calls Satan's and the powers. It could be argued that the Western world is incredibly naive in how it thinks about evil. I believe, as a follower of Jesus, based on his teachings, that evil is personified and real, that it has a name, Satan. And this spiritual being that goes by the name of Satan through the New Testament is in league with a whole array of other spiritual beings. Who knows how many? All at war with God and with all that is good, beautiful, and true in God's world. And that a huge chunk of this world is right now, not for long, under his control. The Bible has all sorts of names for these creatures: angels, demons, spirits, princes, principalities, heavenly beings, gods, powers. The point is, whatever language you prefer, there is a vast society of creatures, some good and others evil, some that partner with God and with you and me to usher in the kingdom of God, but others that are kind of synced up with Satan and at war with God, whose end goal is to drive this world into the ground. As Jesus said of Satan, he comes to steal and kill and destroy. Greg Boyd says, when one possesses a vital awareness that in between God and humanity, there exists a vast society of spiritual beings who are quite like humans in possessing intelligence and free will, there is simply no difficulty in reconciling the reality of evil with the goodness of the supreme God. It virtually sidesteps the problem of evil. When you think about it, evil, you have to factor in Satan and his crew. As C.S. Lewis says, you know there's a mistake that we make when it comes to Satan and the demonic realm. Either we go kind of crazy. And you know people who literally think there's a demon behind every bush, every flat tire, every cold. It's like, oh, how are you doing today? Oh, well, on the way here, on the way to church, Satan just totally got into me and I started having an argument with my wife. And it's a little bit like, maybe it wasn't Satan that caused that. Maybe you were just a little bit stressed as you were getting ready. Maybe you were in a hurry. And maybe that's the reason you ended up having an argument with your wife on the way to church. Satan's not God. He's not omnipresent. He's in one place at one time. And I'm pretty sure he's probably got better stuff to do than rile you up so you have an argument with your spouse on the way to church. But there's a lot of people that just blame Satan for everything rather than some things. But then on the other side of that, you just get people who act as if Satan isn't even real. And that can be even more dangerous because to the degree that you don't take Satan and the demonic realm seriously, you attribute his evil either to other people or to yourself or even worse, to God. When in reality, so much evil is caused not only by human free will, but by spiritual free will of a vast society of beings that have the exact same freedom that you and I have. Then finally, the last kind of factor in this matrix is chaos. So I'm guessing that most of you have heard of chaos theory. If not, you saw Jurassic Park? So the basic idea is that everything is interconnected. The butterfly effect. There is such a thing as random chance in the universe. In theology, it's called natural evil. So not murder or war or genocide. Natural evil could be an earthquake or a tsunami or an avalanche or a blight on a crop. Old Testament scholar John Walton has 3 categories in particular for Genesis: order, disorder, and non-order. Order is the world as God intended it to be, the Garden of Eden. Disorder is the byproduct of sin and how sin has warped the world out of shape. So murder or abuse or adultery, that's disorder. But then this third category is non-order. That's just the chaos in the universe, and it has yet to come under the rule and reign of Jesus. Stuff like an earthquake or a tsunami. So while I very much believe that God could be involved in a natural disaster, and I believe that Satan and the demonic realm could be involved in a natural disaster, it could also just be that it was an earthquake or a tsunami caused not by God's will, not by humans' will, but it could just be that the tectonic plates were rubbing against each other and that caused it. There's a lot of stuff in life that's random, so everything happens for a reason? I don't think so. I think some things happen for a reason and other things are just weird. So as I think about it, when you run an event, good or bad, in your life through this lens, you have to factor in God's will, our will, other people's will, Satan and the powers, and then just life on this side of the resurrection. 2 Corinthians 12:7, Paul writes, because of these surpassingly great revelations, and he's talking about the revelations he's had about God and life and what we now have in the New Testament. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh. We're not exactly sure what he means. Most scholars speculate it's some kind of chronic illness, epilepsy or back disease or something like that. A messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So was this thorn God? We know Paul says it was given to me, but notice he doesn't say by whom. So was it given by God? Was it given by Satan? Was it given by somebody else? Or is this from Satan, a messenger from Satan to torment me, to torture me? Or was it because of Paul's own pride, because of the surpassing revelations to keep me from being conceited? The answer is yes, all of the above. At least 3 are at play here. I can read to you from the end of Genesis 50 about how the brothers sinned against Joseph and how God intended it for good. Example after example where it's not one of the 5, it's 1 or 2 or 3 of the 5 all at the same time. So our theodicy here is more like a web or a nexus than a spectrum. It's a little bit more either or than both and. And if you say, Rachel, that's cheating, well, you're kind of right. Sometimes we can identify, sometimes we can say, right, this suffering was caused by Satan or it was caused by just me and my immaturity or whatever. But there are other times where we just can't see behind the curtain of the universe. And we have to live in that mystery. But what if why is the wrong question? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why does God allow evil and suffering and injustice and war and famine and abuse? I know I found myself asking why a lot after my mother-in-law, who was only just 48, died of terminal cancer. I know I asked that question, why, a lot. But what if it is the wrong question? When it comes to the problem of evil, we want God to say something about it. But God doesn't say something about it. He doesn't give us an explanation. Instead, in the Bible and in Jesus, God does something about it. It could be argued that the Bible is essentially written to tell the story of what God has done, is doing, and will do about evil, and to invite and call you and I to join in that story. So let's quickly have a look at that. The beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then he created humanity, you and me, to partner with God, to draw out the potential and flourishing of the planet. And originally, everything was good. There was no evil at all. So that's why you ache for it and you crave and you desire a world with no evil. In spite of everything that you grew up in, science class and evolutionary theory and survival of the fittest, in spite of everything we know on a scientific level, you still, whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, you ache for Eden because it's in your DNA. That's what God intended. But in the fall, everything went belly up. In Genesis 3, there's a snake that later in the story we realize it symbolizes Satan. And he's there with no explanation. Where did the snake come from? How did he get into the Garden of Eden? It doesn't say. He's just there. An alien intruder in God's very good world. But human beings join in the snake's rebellion against God. And as a result, evil is now officially here to stay. Then God calls out a people to put the world to rights, Israel. But as you read through the Old Testament, you quickly realise that the people of the solution are now part of the problem. The Old Testament is simply the story of one failure after another. But it draws evil to a point, and it all leads up to the coming of Jesus. Jesus, who comes as Israel in person, as humanity in person. All of Israel's history devolves onto Jesus' shoulder, and he takes evil and all of its forms straight to the cross, and there he puts it to death. Now, in theology, how you interpret the meaning or the significance of Jesus' death, which is an event, not an abstract concept or idea, how you interpret that event is called your atonement or atonement theory. In the West, ever since the Reformation a few hundred years ago, the dominant theory of atonement has been a view called substantiary atonement. It's the idea that Jesus died in our place. It's based on the sacrificial system in the Old Testament. He dies, we live. We live, he dies. I believe this. But it might come as a surprise to a number of you to hear that for the first, bare minimum, the dominant theory was not substantiary atonement. It was another view called Christus Victor. That's a Latin phrase meaning the victory of Christ. And it's the idea that in Christ's death and resurrection, because you can't pull them apart, Jesus won the decisive battle against evil. Evil was still here, but the cross and the resurrection were essentially, if you know your World War II history, it was D-Day. After D-Day, Hitler was essentially done, but there were still years left of fighting. That's what Jesus' death and resurrection was. He crushed the spine of Satan and the powers. He beat back sin at an individual level and a society-wide level. And he, in his resurrection, defeated death itself. Now, which one is right? Well, I believe both of them. I think they all go beautifully together. It's very much a both and. But I think that Christus Victor is the knife's edge in how we think about the cross. Again, Greg Boyd writes this. Christ's incarnation, death and resurrection reveal that, though God is not culpable for the evil in the world, he nevertheless takes responsibility for the evil in the world. And in taking responsibility for it, he overcomes it. On the cross, God suffers at the hands of evil. And in this suffering and through his resurrection, he, in principle, destroys evil. Through the cross and resurrection, God unequivocally displays his loving character and establishes his loving purpose for the world, despite its evil resistance. He therefore demonstrates that evil is not something God wills into existence. It is something he wills out of existence. So Jesus' death and resurrection are kind of the climax of the story, but it's not the end. Jesus' death and resurrection move on. Jesus then in the New Testament calls his followers, you and me, to join his work, his kingdom work, to overcome evil with good. And then the New Testament looks forward over the horizon to Jesus' return, to Judgment Day, which for followers of Jesus is a good thing. It's a day when Jesus comes back, and evil is not sort of gone, not kind of gone. It's all gone for good. Jesus puts the world to right forever. This is the hope of the gospel. Over a decade ago, after the tsunami in the Indian Ocean in 2004 that killed 230,000 people, John Piper wrote an essay in which he said that it was the will of God. He said, and I quote, "Satan is not the decisive cause of more than 100,000 deaths. God is." In response, there was an Orthodox theologian by the name of David Bentley Hart that wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal that eventually became a book. It's a beautiful, loving, humble pushback to Piper, and that this is the will of God mentality. And at one point in the essay, he writes this: of a child dying in agonizing death from diphtheria, of a young mother ravaged by cancer, of tens of thousands of agents swallowed in an instant by the sea, of millions murdered in death camps and gulags and forced famines. Our faith is in a God who has come to rescue his creation from the absurdity of sin and the emptiness of death. So we are permitted to hate these things with a perfect hatred. As for comfort, when we seek it, I can imagine none greater than the happy knowledge that when I see the death of a child, I do not see the face of God, but the face of his enemy. It is a faith that has set us free from optimism and taught us hope instead. Paul writes this in Romans 8:18. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. He means to be set free from sin forever. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth, right up to this present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly, as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. And in Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. That last line is often misquoted as all things work together for good. The Bible does not say that. But not only is it one of the most misquoted lines in all of the New Testament, it could be argued that it is the one of the most misunderstood. This passage is about our present sufferings, as Paul said, and to compare and contrast that with our hope for the future. And Paul has all this beautiful stuff to say about hope. Hope is not wishful thinking in Paul's mind. It is the declarative, definitive, resolute expectation of coming good based on the character of God. But for Paul, our hope is not that one, nothing bad will happen to us. Jesus said the exact opposite. In this world, you will face tribulation. That's a promise from Jesus. So our hope isn't that nothing bad will happen. And our hope isn't that everything that happens to us is the will of God. Our hope is that no matter what happens, Jesus is back from the dead. He is the king over the world, over the universe itself. His kingdom is here and it's coming. And no matter what you face, whether your life is easy or hard, whether your dreams come true or you face crushing disappointment, no matter what it is, God is with you. You are not alone. He knows suffering better than anybody. And if you turn over all of the broken pieces of your life to Jesus, he has an uncanny ability that God and only God has to take the broken pieces of your life and turn it into something beautiful. To somehow take evil, and even though it's evil, turn it into good. So what if why really is the wrong question? What if what is the better question? Not why did this bad thing happen to me as I was a child, or through my divorce, or infertility, or singleness, or marriage. Not why. Instead, look for what God wants to do out of your suffering. As you turn over your pain, as you turn over your disappointment, as you turn over your family of origin, as you turn over your cracked relationship with your parents, as you turn over whatever it is that's in your mind's eye right now. Ask these questions 1. What is God going to do in the end? We know the end of the story. A day is coming when God puts out the fire of racism, injustice, the dark underbelly of globalization, betrayal, abuse, death, loss, and everything in between. And it's finally and fully gone forever. So no matter how bad your suffering is on this side of the resurrection, and I know for some it's legitimate and it's hard, but know that this life is temporary. I know that doesn't make it easy, but it makes it easier. This life is temporary. Your life is a blip on a line that is stretching into eternity as a follower of Jesus. This life is not all that there is. And you have to say that to yourself over and over and over again. This life is not all there is. And the life that's coming is not less real, but more real. And it's not just me up in heaven forever. It's me here on earth, living the life that God intended for me all along. And you have to ask that question over and over. What is God going to do in the end? Secondly, what is God going to do through this in the meantime? In between now and then, the resurrection, what is God going to do through my suffering? Jesus has this bizarre judo kind of ability to use his opponent's weight against them, to take evil, injustice, divorce, betrayal, and turn it on its head and weave it into a tapestry of beauty. So as you open up your pain to Jesus, watch for Jesus to do something beautiful in and through your suffering. But don't just watch for Jesus to do something. Join with Jesus. Leverage all of your suffering for what Jesus is on about in the world. And then finally, you have to ask the other what question. What is God doing or trying to do in me right now? The hard knocks of life are the crucible where Jesus does some of his best work. Some of you are in that spot right now. And please know that suffering will either make you or it will break you. It can be, if you open your life up to Jesus, an incubator to grow and mature into a freedom that you never thought was possible. Into what Jesus calls life, that is truly life. This is the hope of the gospel. Not a flimsy optimism, not a flimsy, oh, the best is yet to come, no worries. Not that. That doesn't get you very far in reality, but hope. Brutally honest about the pain and suffering of life, but grounded in the soil under the cross and in the empty tomb that Jesus is King and that he's back from the dead. In closing, here's a quote from N.T. Wright that does a good job of capturing this theme. We are not told, not in any way, that satisfies our puzzled questioning how and why there is radical evil within God's wonderful, beautiful, and essentially good creation. One day, I think we shall find out. But I believe we are incapable of understanding it at the moment, in the same way a baby in the womb would lack the categories to think about the outside world. What we are promised, however, is that God will make a world in which we all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well. And we are given this promise not as a matter of whistling in the dark, not as something to believe though there is no evidence, but in and through Jesus Christ and his death and resurrection, and in and through the Spirit, through whom the achievement of Jesus becomes a reality in our world and in our life.